Part 1. The Boy Who Was Too Small. Every legend begins somewhere ordinary, but some legends start so small, so fragile, that the idea they would ever change history seems almost laughable. This story begins in North Texas, in the dusty stretch of Hunt County, near the tiny crossroads of Kingston. The year was 1925. The world was still reeling from the First World War, and America was sliding toward the Great Depression. Farms were failing, families were starving, and dreams were as dry as the Texas soil. That's where Audie Leon Murphy was born, a boy who came into a world already struggling to feed itself. He was one of 12 children born to Emmett and Josie Murphy, poor sharecroppers who lived in a wooden shack with no electricity, no running water, and little hope. The family survived by working the land that didn't belong to them, picking cotton in the brutal sun, earning pennies that vanished before the week was done. A childhood of dust and hunger. Audie's childhood was not the stuff of American fairy tales. There were no Christmas mornings with gifts, no lazy Sundays, no safety nets. His earliest memories were of hunger, hard labor, and the quiet despair of his parents' exhaustion. His father, Emmett, drifted in and out of the family's life, a man broken by poverty and perhaps by his own failures. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, chasing rumors of work, and return empty-handed. His mother, Josie Belle Murphy, was the anchor, gentle, deeply religious, and fiercely protective of her children. It was Josie who taught Audie to pray, to believe, to endure. She was the only constant in his world of chaos. But endurance doesn't fill an empty stomach. When his father was gone, Audie became the provider. Armed with a single-shot .22 rifle that was nearly taller than he was, the boy took to the woods to hunt rabbits and squirrels. It wasn't sport, it was survival. Every shot mattered. Every missed shot meant someone went hungry. Neighbors remembered him as the quiet one, polite, reserved, with watchful blue eyes that seemed older than his years. He was small, even for his age, scrawny, pale, and almost delicate-looking. But there was something about him, a steadiness, a sense that behind that silence was a spark that refused to die. And in the long Texas evenings, when work was done and the fields turned gold under the sunset, that spark would sometimes reveal itself. He'd stand at the fence line, rifle in hand, and shoot the heads off tin cans from 50 yards, calmly, effortlessly, as if he were practicing for something much larger. The weight of loss. In 1939, the Great Depression was still crushing rural America. Audie's family could barely hold on. His older siblings began to scatter, taking jobs, marrying, or simply leaving. Then, in 1940, came the blow that would define the rest of his life. His mother fell gravely ill. Josie had worked herself to the bone, keeping her family alive. Years of malnutrition, exhaustion, and illness finally took their toll. She died in 1941 when Audie was just 16. He was devastated. He would later say, "She was the only one who ever understood me." He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, not because he didn't care, but because there was no point. Books didn't feed families. He worked odd jobs, picking cotton, driving trucks, doing whatever he could. But the farm felt emptier without her. And then, in December 1941, came Pearl Harbor. The radio crackled with the news that Japan had attacked the United States. America was at war. Overnight, the country changed. Factories roared to life. Posters shouted, "Uncle Sam wants you," and boys across America looked to the horizon. For millions, war was a call to adventure. For Audie Murphy, it was something else entirely. It was a chance to escape. At 16, Audie was barely 5'5" and weighed just 110 pounds. He looked younger, closer to 14, but in his heart, he was already decades older. He walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office and said he wanted to fight. The recruiter took one look at him and burst out laughing. "Son, the Corps needs men, not paper dolls." Next came the Navy. Rejected. The paratroopers. Rejected. Even the Marines, famous for making warriors out of boys, told him no. It wasn't personal. It was arithmetic. He didn't meet the height and weight standards. But Murphy didn't take no for an answer. He went to the Army recruiting office, lied about his age, and finally convinced them to take him. He was 17 years old when he raised his right hand and swore the oath. His official weight on the enlistment form, 112 pounds, just barely enough to qualify. The date was June 30th, 1942. In the photo taken that day, he looks like a boy playing dress-up, the oversized uniform hanging off his frame, his expression uncertain. But inside that thin frame was a will of steel. Camp Walters, the making of a soldier. Murphy's first stop was Camp Walters near Mineral Wells, Texas. It was here that recruits learned to march, shoot, dig foxholes, and follow orders, the fundamentals of becoming a soldier. Drill instructors took one look at Murphy and shook their heads. He was too light to carry a full pack, too small to handle the recoil of an M1 Garand for long. They nicknamed him Baby and expected him to wash out. But Murphy didn't. He trained harder than anyone else. When the other men collapsed during forced marches, Murphy kept going. When they cursed the drills, he stayed silent. There was something almost eerie about his determination, as if he were driven by something deeper than patriotism. Perhaps it was the ghost of his mother, or the shame of poverty, or the desire to prove to the world that he was more than too small. By the time he completed basic training, the instructors had stopped laughing. One wrote in his file, "This man is small, but tough, hard as nails. Shoots like a marksman." Murphy was assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, and shipped out to North Africa in early 1943. He'd never been on a ship before. He'd never left Texas. Now he was crossing the Atlantic, heading into a world war. When he arrived in North Africa, the U.S. Army was still learning how to fight. The landings in North Africa had been chaotic. Supply lines were broken. Commanders were inexperienced. And yet, Murphy absorbed everything: terrain, tactics, behavior under fire. He was a fast learner in the school of chaos. Sicily, baptism by fire. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The plan was to drive the Axis powers off the island and open the way to Italy. The fighting was fierce, hot, and personal. Hills, villages, ambushes. Murphy got his first taste of combat there, and it changed him forever. He saw men he'd trained with cut down by machine gun fire. He learned how fast a body can drop, how blood looks on dry soil, how noise and silence both become unbearable. He also learned something else. He wasn't afraid. When his squad's sergeant was killed during a firefight, Murphy instinctively took command. He crawled through barbed wire, flanked the enemy position, and neutralized a machine gun nest almost single-handedly. Afterward, when officers asked how he did it, he simply said, "It needed to be done." That calmness under fire, that unshakable focus, became his signature. His comrades began to whisper, "Murphy doesn't flinch." He was promoted to corporal, then sergeant. By 19, he was leading men older and bigger than himself. Sicily was only the beginning. The real test came in Italy, where the Allies launched one of the most grueling campaigns of the war, a slow, bloody push up the peninsula against mountains, rain, and some of the toughest German defenses in Europe. Murphy fought from Salerno to Anzio, through villages reduced to rubble, across rivers choked with the dead. He saw horror daily, and yet something inside him remained steady. He wasn't invincible. He was simply unbreakable. At Anzio, he and his men endured months of bombardment, trapped in trenches and foxholes, as the Germans pounded their positions with artillery day and night. Sleep came in 30-minute bursts. Food was cold rations. The mud was endless. Men cracked under the strain. Some wept, some deserted. Some simply went silent and never spoke again. But not Murphy. He'd crawl from foxhole to foxhole under enemy fire, checking on his men, offering cigarettes, quiet words, and orders that made sense in the chaos. He earned the Bronze Star, then the Silver Star, and then another. Each time the reports said the same thing: displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. The quiet farm boy from Texas had become a leader of men. Still, something about him troubled those around him. His calmness bordered on the unnerving. He took risks that others wouldn't. He volunteered for missions that made no sense, and yet he always came back. One lieutenant remarked, half in awe, half in fear, "It's like he's not afraid to die." Maybe he wasn't. Maybe, in his own way, he'd already died in Texas, when he buried his mother, when he lost his childhood, when life taught him that pain was normal. Toward France. By mid-1944, the war was shifting. The Allies had landed in Normandy, pushing toward Germany. Murphy's unit was pulled out of Italy and sent to southern France for Operation Dragoon, the lesser-known invasion that came from the Mediterranean. It was there, in the hills and forests of southern France, that Murphy's legend truly began to take shape. He led patrols that ambushed German convoys. He captured enemy soldiers, almost single-handedly. He moved through combat like someone who'd long accepted death as a companion, not a fear. But fate had one more chapter waiting, one that would test every ounce of his endurance, courage, and sanity. It would happen in January 1945, near a small frozen French village called Holtzwihr. There, Audie Murphy, the boy once rejected for being too small, would climb onto a burning tank destroyer, face down 250 German soldiers alone, and become a one-man army. Part 2. Hellfire in Holtzwihr. Steady, building tension like a heartbeat. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, at least on paper. Hitler's empire was collapsing. Allied troops were pushing through France and into Germany, but the dying beast was thrashing violently, refusing to go quietly. And in one cold, forgotten corner of eastern France, a 19-year-old lieutenant was about to meet destiny face to face. It was January 26, 1945, near a small village called Holtzwihr, nestled in the Alsace region. Snow covered the ground. The air stung with freezing wind, and the world looked like it had been drained of color, just gray, white, and death. The men of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, had been fighting without rest for weeks. They were 40 men, left from a company that once numbered over 100. They were exhausted, half-frozen, and short on ammunition. The Germans, on the other hand, were not finished. Intelligence reported that an entire German Panzer Grenadier battalion, over 250 elite soldiers backed by 6 tanks, was preparing a counterattack to retake Holzwihr. And standing in their way were those 40 Americans, including one small, sharp-eyed Texan, now wearing the bars of a second lieutenant. His name was Audie Murphy. Murphy's men were dug in along the edge of a frozen field, near a road lined with skeletal trees. They had 2 M10 tank destroyers for support, open-topped vehicles armed with 3-inch guns. But those guns were nearly useless against the kind of armored force the Germans were sending. The Americans knew what was coming. The radio crackled with reports of armor moving. Tracks clanked in the distance, and the wind carried the sound of engines. Low, steady, relentless. Murphy ordered his men to take cover in the tree line and prepare to defend. He could have called for retreat. He didn't. One of his sergeants later said, "When he gave orders, you followed. Not because he shouted, but because you knew he'd be the last one to leave." The first shells landed minutes later. German mortars pounded the field, shaking the earth. Trees splintered, snow erupted into clouds of dirt and smoke. The M10 tank destroyers opened fire, the thunder of their guns echoing across the valley. But the enemy kept coming. Through the smoke appeared the shapes of panzers, black crosses on their armor, crawling forward like mechanical beasts. Behind them, German infantry advanced in formation, rifles and machine guns glinting under the gray light. One of the tank destroyers was hit and burst into flames. The crew bailed out, scrambling for cover as shells exploded around them. Murphy grabbed the radio handset, calling artillery support. His voice was calm, precise, professional. Coordinates, distances, corrections. The artillery answered. Shells whistled overhead, landing among the German ranks. But there were too many of them. The line was collapsing. Murphy realized that if his men stayed, they'd be wiped out. So he gave an order that no soldier wants to give. "Fall back to the woods. Hold your positions there." Then, while his men retreated, Audie Murphy stayed, alone. He crouched beside the burning M10, the heat blistering his face. German infantry were less than 100 yards away. He could see them clearly now. Gray coats, white camouflage, the flash of muzzles. He could hear their shouts, the distinct rattle of MG-42s cut through the snowstorm of sound. Murphy looked at the burning tank destroyer. The flames roared from the engine compartment, the 3-inch gun useless. But mounted on the turret was a 50 caliber Browning machine gun, heavy, brutal, and still intact. He made a decision that defied logic, training, and survival. He climbed onto the burning tank destroyer. The metal seared his boots. The smoke choked his lungs. The ammunition inside the vehicle could have detonated at any second. And then he opened fire. The sound of the 50 cal split the winter air like thunder. For the next 60 minutes, one man turned a burning tank into a fortress. He raked the advancing Germans with deadly bursts, cutting down entire squads as they tried to cross the open field. He was so close he could see their faces, their eyes, their panic. They tried to flank him, to crawl through the snow, to charge the wreck, and each time he mowed them down. He was calling artillery the entire time, radio in one hand, machine gun in the other. He directed fire onto his own position, telling the artillery officer on the other end, "That's right, fire for effect. Right on me. I'm the only one left." The explosions landed within yards of him. The earth shook. Smoke and snow filled the air. The Germans hesitated, thinking they were under a full barrage. They had no idea that the fire was being called by the man they were trying to kill. Witnesses later said it didn't look humanly possible. One man on the radio, one gun blazing, against hundreds. A soldier watching from the woods said, "We thought he was dead 10 times over, but every time the smoke cleared, there he was, still firing. Murphy kept shooting until the .50 caliber ran out of ammunition. Then he jumped off the burning vehicle, limped back toward his men, and refused medical evacuation. His leg was bleeding, his uniform burned, his ears ringing. He rejoined his men, reorganized the survivors, and led a counterattack to drive the remaining Germans out of the area. By the end of the battle, over 50 German soldiers lay dead. The attack was broken, and the survivors were retreating. The Americans had lost 2 tank destroyers and a handful of men, but the line held. Holzwehr remained in Allied hands because of one man. When it was over, Murphy was so exhausted he could barely stand. He later said, "I was scared, but I stayed because if I ran, they'd kill my men." That sentence captures him better than any medal ever could. He wasn't fearless, he was terrified. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to act in spite of it. For his actions that day, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor the United States can give. The official citation reads like something out of myth. Second Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire on the enemy even after being wounded and alone. His directing of artillery fire killed or wounded 50 German soldiers, and his refusal to leave his position saved his company from annihilation. He also received the French Legion of Honor, the French Croix de Guerre, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars and 2 Bronze Stars, making him the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He was 19 years old. In the days that followed, the stories spread through the division like wildfire. Men who had seen everything, who had lost friends in Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio, couldn't believe what they'd heard. A few thought it was exaggeration. Then they saw the wreckage, the burned M10, the twisted metal, the frozen German bodies scattered across the field. It wasn't legend, it was fact. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Audie Murphy returned home a hero. Newspapers called him America's most decorated soldier. He appeared on the cover of Life magazine, the small, sharp-featured kid from Texas, now the face of victory. But if you look at that photo closely, his expression isn't joy. It's fatigue. There's something in his eyes, something that doesn't fit with parades or speeches. He was home, yes, but the war hadn't left him. He was still there, in that snow-covered field in France, staring through the sights of a .50 caliber machine gun as the world burned around him. At the age of 20, Audie Murphy had survived more death, fear, and chaos than most men see in a lifetime. And yet the battle that truly tested him wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Because once the shooting stopped, he would face an enemy that couldn't be shot, bombed, or ordered to retreat. An enemy inside his own mind. That's where we go next, to the hidden chapter history rarely tells. The part they left out of the parades and medals. The part Audie Murphy himself couldn't outrun. The war was over, but his war, his real war, had only just begun. Part 3. After the guns fell silent. When Audie Murphy came home in 1945, America was celebrating. Flags waved from every house, brass bands played, parades rolled through main streets across the country. He was only 20 years old, a boy by age, a veteran by soul, and already the most decorated soldier in U.S. history. He had fought in 9 major campaigns across Europe, survived countless ambushes, and single-handedly stopped a German assault. To the public, he was the perfect symbol of American courage. To Murphy himself, he was just tired. He returned to a country that wanted heroes. People wanted to hear stories about bravery and victory, not fear or nightmares. When he stepped off the train in Texas, reporters swarmed him. Flashbulbs went off. People shouted his name. Mothers pushed their children forward to shake his hand. The governor offered him honors. The newspapers printed his photo on the front page with headlines like, "One-man army returns home." But for Murphy, all the noise felt unreal. The war had burned something deep into him that celebration couldn't touch. He went to visit his mother's grave first.
He knelt beside the marker, the sound of cicadas in the air, and for the first time in years, he wept. Everything he had done, every risk, every moment of terror, he said had been for her. Standing there, surrounded by the quiet Texas fields, he realized how far away that burning tank destroyer felt now, and yet how close it still lived inside his head. He tried to live a normal life, but normal no longer existed. He couldn't sleep. Loud noises made him flinch. He would wake up drenched in sweat, grabbing for a rifle that wasn't there. In the daylight he smiled, signed autographs, shook hands, but at night he relived Holtzwehr again and again. Doctors didn't call it PTSD then. They called it battle fatigue or nervous exhaustion. It was treated with rest, silence, and shame. Murphy never asked for help. He just kept moving. America moved too, into a new age of prosperity, television, and Hollywood dreams. In 1945, actor James Cagney read about the young Texan hero and invited him to California. Cagney thought Murphy had a natural camera presence, something stoic, authentic, unpolished. The studios agreed. Audie, though, didn't see himself as an actor. He was broke, restless, and suspicious of glamour. But he accepted the offer because he had nowhere else to go. Hollywood embraced him instantly. He was photogenic in a quiet, boyish way, the kind of man the public could believe in. Not the tall, square-jawed superhero, but the lean, watchful face of an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. Yet Murphy never learned to act in the usual sense. He didn't perform. He just stood there, said the lines softly, and let something real flicker behind his eyes. That calm, weary truth that came from having lived through hell. In 1949, he played himself in To Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his own memoir. It became one of the most successful war movies of its era. On screen, audiences saw him recreate the battles, the mud, the fear. They saw the boy from Texas become a soldier again, fighting across Europe, and finally facing the Germans in that frozen field in France. They cheered, they cried, they believed. What they didn't see was what it cost him to do it. During filming, crew members said that Murphy sometimes froze on set, lost in memories. The smell of smoke, the sound of blank gunfire, it pulled him back. When that happened, he would quietly step away until the tremors stopped, then return and finish the scene as if nothing happened. The movie made him famous beyond imagination. He became a public figure, decorated, handsome, in demand. He appeared in westerns, war dramas, and even romantic films. But he hated interviews. He hated parties. The Hollywood crowd didn't understand him. He would often sit silently in a corner, staring into space, chain smoking, polite but distant. He didn't drink much at first, but over time, alcohol became the only thing that could dull the noise in his head. He once told a friend, "I can't sleep unless I've got a gun under my pillow." That wasn't bravado. It was survival. The war had wired him to stay alert. At night, he'd sometimes wake and patrol his own house, checking windows and doors, making sure the perimeter was safe. His wife, Pamela Archer Murphy, learned to live with it. She said he could be gentle, funny, and generous, but also withdrawn, haunted, unpredictable. He'd go from silence to rage in seconds, she recalled. Not at me, just at the ghosts. Those ghosts never left. The medals, the fame, the movie roles, none of it gave him peace. He once said to a reporter, "You know what's strange? They build you up, make you a hero, and all you want is to forget." That contradiction followed him everywhere. People saw the uniform and thought they knew him. But the real Murphy lived behind a thin wall of composure that cracked more each year. He tried to help other veterans. He spoke openly about battle fatigue, saying it wasn't weakness, it was the mind's way of saying enough. In an era when most men were told to stay silent, his honesty was radical. He testified before Congress about the need for better treatment of veterans, insisting that those who fought deserved not just medals, but care. It was a voice ahead of its time, one that America would understand only decades later. Still, he couldn't heal himself. He gambled, lost money, and grew restless. The movie offers slowed down. The roles got smaller. The fame faded, as it always does, and the quiet grew heavier. He lived on a ranch for a while, surrounded by horses and open land, a soldier's kind of peace. But even there, the nights were long. People who knew him later in life said he was kind but unreachable, like someone half in another world. One director recalled, he'd walk onto the set, say his lines perfectly, then disappear. You'd find him later sitting alone, staring at the hills. When he spoke about the war, he didn't glorify it. He described it the way only those who truly saw it can, with the flat, emotionless honesty of a man who knows there's nothing noble about death. He said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." By the 1960s, Murphy's health was deteriorating. The nightmares worsened, and his body carried the scars of years of exhaustion. He was still young, only in his 40s, but looked older. He stayed busy with small film projects and public appearances, still trying to balance his legend with his own humanity. Deep down, though, he knew the war had never really ended for him. It had simply changed shape. In 1971, at the age of 45, Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in the mountains of Virginia. The official report said the fog was thick, visibility poor. He was traveling for business. Some say it was just a tragic accident. Others, who knew his demons, wondered quietly if part of him had already made peace with leaving. But no one really knows. When word of his death reached the country, America mourned him like a fallen hero of another era. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew thousands. Old soldiers stood at attention, saluted as the flag was folded. The president sent condolences. His grave became one of the most visited sites in Arlington, second only to President Kennedy's. Yet the story didn't end there. Because while America remembered Audie Murphy as its most decorated soldier, one woman would spend the next 3 decades making sure that the rest of his mission, the one about helping others, never died with him. That woman was Pamela Murphy, his widow. And her story, quiet, humble, and almost forgotten, would become the final, unseen chapter of this American legend. Part 4. The Private War. When the guns fell silent for Audie Murphy, they kept echoing in his wife's life. Pamela Archer Murphy was never a celebrity. She wasn't part of the Hollywood sparkle that had briefly surrounded her husband. She was quiet, practical, the kind of person who saw through fame to the person underneath. When she married Audie in 1951, she wasn't marrying a war hero or a movie star. She was marrying a man she believed still had something good left to build in the world. She would soon learn that living with a man who carried a battlefield inside him was like living in a house with a constant, invisible fire. There were nights when he'd wake up shouting, sweating, convinced the enemy was coming. There were days when he couldn't focus, when a car backfiring made him drop to the ground. Pamela learned to speak softly, move slowly, and give him space. She loved him, but she also fought a quiet war of her own, one against fear, exhaustion, and loneliness. They had 2 sons, and Murphy tried to be a good father. On his better days, he'd take them horseback riding, tell them stories about the farm where he grew up. He'd smile, laugh, and for a few hours he looked free. But the darkness always came back. His sons later said they could tell when the war was back in the house. It was in the way he stared off at nothing, or the way he'd keep a loaded gun on the nightstand. Pamela didn't try to change him. She just tried to hold the family together. When Audie died in that plane crash in 1971, Pamela's world collapsed in silence. There were condolences, headlines, tributes, flowers, all the things that come with the death of a national hero. But after the ceremonies ended, she was left with the quiet. 2 boys, a modest home, and memories of a man who had never truly escaped his war. Most widows of famous men would have written a book, gone on television, tried to preserve their husband's name in lights. Pamela did something else entirely. She took a clerical job at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Los Angeles, working at the information desk. It was just a low-paying government job, nothing glamorous. Her co-workers didn't even know at first that she was the Mrs. Audie Murphy. She never told anyone. She didn't ask for special treatment. She just showed up day after day and worked. And that's where her own legacy began. Veterans would come through the doors of that VA hospital. Young men from Vietnam, older ones from Korea or World War II. And they'd find this calm, kind woman who somehow understood them. She didn't wear her husband's medals. She didn't talk about fame. She just listened. When the bureaucratic system failed them, she fought quietly to make it right. If a veteran couldn't get an appointment, she'd find a way. If their paperwork got lost, she'd dig it up herself. And if some official tried to turn them away, she'd stand her ground. Her co-workers said she was a one-woman army. Mrs. Murphy never raised her voice, one VA nurse remembered. But if she said something needed to be done, you did it, because you knew she was right. Over the next 35 years, Pamela became an unofficial guardian angel for thousands of veterans. Many of them had no idea who she was, not until someone told them her story. "Wait," they'd say, "you mean the Audie Murphy's wife?" And she'd just smile and wave it off. "That was his job," she'd say. "This is mine." Her office wasn't decorated with movie posters or medals. It had pictures of veterans she'd helped, letters from families thanking her, and a small photograph of Audie tucked into a corner. She never remarried, never sought fame. She believed her husband's story wasn't about medals or movies. It was about duty, and she carried that duty for the rest of her life. There's a story a Vietnam veteran once told about her. He came into the hospital furious because the VA had lost his claim for benefits. He'd been waiting months, living on nothing, ready to give up. Then he met Pamela. She listened to him for 15 minutes, made a few phone calls, and within a week, his file was found and processed. He came back to thank her and saw her standing at the desk with a dozen other veterans lined up waiting for help. "You saved me," he said. And she just smiled and said, "That's what we do here." No cameras, no applause, no press releases, just quiet service. In a way, Pamela fought the war Audie never could, the war of coming home. She saw what the battlefield had done to thousands of men, and she refused to let them be forgotten. She made the VA not just a government office, but a place where someone cared. When she finally retired in the early 2000s, veterans filled the hallways to say goodbye. Some cried, some saluted. The hospital staff held a small ceremony, and the director read a statement saying she had served her country with the same courage and honor as her husband. She blushed and said, "Oh, don't be silly." But the truth was, she had. Pamela Murphy passed away in 2010 at the age of 90. The Los Angeles Times ran an obituary calling her a quiet hero in her own right. Veterans from across the country sent flowers. Some who'd known her decades before drove hours just to pay respects. At her funeral, one retired Marine said, "Audie fought for us overseas. Pamela fought for us here." That, in many ways, is the missing page of the Audie Murphy story. The medals, the war, the movies, they're all part of history. But the real legacy lived in the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let that history fade into bureaucracy. She kept his mission alive, not with a gun or a camera, but with a desk, a phone, and a heart that wouldn't quit. In her, the spirit of the greatest generation continued long after the battlefields turned to grass and memory. She proved that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a clerk's badge and a patient smile. By the time she passed, new generations had almost forgotten who Audie Murphy was. But among the veterans she helped, his name and hers meant something sacred. They were symbols of what America once promised its soldiers, that no one would be left behind, not in battle and not in peace. As one of her co-workers said after she was gone, Mrs. Murphy never stopped fighting for her soldiers. She just changed the battlefield. Part 5. The Legacy of Fire and Grace. History has a strange way of simplifying people. It chisels them down into names, medals, and headlines. And in that process, the living heart of their story often fades. Audie Murphy became, over time, a kind of myth. The baby-faced boy who killed hundreds of Germans, who stood atop a flaming tank destroyer and refused to die. But myths are made of distance. The real Audie Murphy was closer, smaller, more human. And in that humanity lies the true magnitude of his story. After his death, America moved on. The Vietnam War was raging, and the country was divided, cynical, tired of hero worship. The black and white moral clarity of World War II no longer fit the new generation's world. Murphy's kind of courage, simple, selfless, rural, unpretentious, felt like a relic from another century. For years he was taught in history classes only as a footnote, America's most decorated soldier. A sentence, a statue, a medal count. But time, as it often does, has a way of circling back to the truth. When scholars began studying the psychological cost of combat, what we now call PTSD, Murphy's story gained a new weight. The hero who never gave up on the battlefield had spent his life fighting an invisible war at home. The boy who could face down a German division couldn't outrun his own memories. His honesty about that, rare in the 1950s, became one of his most lasting acts of bravery. In an age when soldiers were expected to stay silent, Murphy told the world that courage and pain were not opposites. He said, "If you go through hell and come back, it doesn't mean you're weak if you can't forget." Those words, unrecorded in official speeches but remembered by friends, became a quiet anthem for generations of veterans who finally had a name for what haunted them. When modern veterans visit Arlington, many still stop at his grave. It's simple, just white marble engraved with Audie L. Murphy, Medal of Honor. There are always small tokens there, coins, patches, dog tags, sometimes even handwritten letters. One note found there read, "Thank you for showing us that heroes can hurt too." Hollywood, in its way, has kept his story alive, but never quite captured it fully. The movie To Hell and Back was a hit, but it was only half the story. The real Murphy's hell didn't end when the credits rolled. If anything, it began there. And yet even that tragedy gives his legacy depth. Because Audie Murphy's life is not a tale of endless glory. It's a study in resilience, the kind that doesn't end when the war does. In interviews late in his life, when asked what kept him going, Murphy said, "I had to look after my man." Even when he was alone, he still spoke like an officer. That sense of duty never left him. And that, perhaps, is the common thread that ties his life and Pamela's together. Both of them lived by a code that didn't come from medals or movies. It came from the simple conviction that you take care of your own. Audie did it on the battlefield. Pamela did it in the hospital corridors. Two kinds of courage, one loud, one silent, one written in smoke and fire, the other in patience and paperwork. Together, they tell a single story about what heroism truly means. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear stop you from doing what's right. When historians discuss the greatest generation, they often focus on the men, the soldiers, the sailors, the pilots. But women like Pamela were the quiet architecture that held the veterans' world together afterward. For every man who stormed a beach, there was someone like her back home, making sure that when he returned, he wasn't forgotten. If Audie Murphy represented America's courage in war, Pamela Murphy represented its conscience in peace. Their story also mirrors America's long struggle to understand the real cost of its victories. In 1945, the country wanted heroes. By 1975, it began to realize that heroes can break too. And today, we finally understand that valor and vulnerability can share the same uniform. In that sense, Audie Murphy's life and his wife's became prophetic. They were living proof that bravery doesn't always look like charging into fire. Sometimes, it looks like getting up every morning, facing the memories, and choosing to keep living. One of the most moving things about his legacy is how ordinary people, not generals, not politicians, have kept it alive. In 1996, a group of veterans and volunteers raised funds to restore the Audie Murphy American Cotton Museum in Greenville, Texas, his birthplace. They filled it not with Hollywood props or weapons, but with letters, photos, and the kinds of humble items that told who he really was: the farm boy, the dreamer, the quiet man with haunted eyes. One exhibit displays a pair of worn cowboy boots, and a handwritten note that simply reads, "Property of Audie Murphy. Do not throw away." Somehow, that says more than all the medals combined. There's another exhibit dedicated to Pamela. It features her old VA desk nameplate and a small plaque that reads, "She served those who served." When visitors see it, they often pause longer there than at the guns or uniforms. Because in that small brass sign lies the other half of the Murphy story, the half about healing, not fighting. If you visit Audie's grave at Arlington, you'll notice something curious. The grass around it is always slightly more worn than the rest. That's because so many people stop there. They don't just look, they linger. Some talk softly, some just stand in silence. And every Memorial Day, without fail, someone leaves a bouquet of wild Texas flowers and a note addressed to Pam. No one knows who does it. Maybe an old friend, maybe a veteran she helped, maybe someone who just understands. For those who study history, Audie Murphy remains a paradox, a gentle-faced warrior, a legend who hated killing, a hero who never wanted to be one. But for those who feel history, he represents something more personal, the proof that even the smallest person, from the poorest corner of America, can rise to meet the impossible and pay the price for it afterward. He was 5'5", 110 pounds, turned down by the Marines and the paratroopers for being too small. Yet he stood taller in history than almost anyone. The man who climbed onto that burning tank destroyer in France wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting because his men were counting on him. He stayed not because he wanted to die, but because someone had to hold the line. And that's the kind of courage the world rarely sees, because it doesn't fit into speeches or parades. It's the courage of the moment when there's no one else left, and you do the unthinkable simply because it's the right thing to do. Pamela understood that. She lived it. Her entire life was an echo of that same moment, the quiet version of it. A woman standing her post, holding her ground, refusing to let anyone be forgotten. So in the end, this isn't just a war story. It's a love story. Not the romantic kind, the enduring kind. The love of duty, of honor, of the wounded, of the lost. The love that binds two people who never stopped fighting, one with a gun, the other with a heart. When the last generation who remembers World War II is gone, Audie and Pamela's story will still matter, because it's not really about war at all. It's about what happens after. It's about how a country measures its heroes, and whether it still remembers them when the uniforms come off. The final chapter of their legacy doesn't live in museums or graves. It lives in every veteran who still walks into a VA hospital and finds someone willing to listen. It lives in every small-town kid who's told he's not big enough, not strong enough, and decides to prove the world wrong. And it lives in every person who believes that courage, real courage, doesn't end when the battle does. In Holtzfir, France, the frozen field where Audie made his stand still exists. The trees have grown back. The land is quiet again. But locals say that sometimes, in the still winter air, they can feel something there. A presence, maybe. Or just the weight of memory. There's a monument with his name, weathered by time, surrounded by flowers left by strangers who come from all over the world. They come not to glorify war, but to remember a man who refused to surrender. and a woman who made sure he never would. That's the legacy of Audie and Pamela Murphy, a one-man army and a one-woman army, both undefeated, even in death.